Hello, pattern readers. This video is going to be another in my series of lessons from fantasy adaptations. I'm doing a deep dive into book-to-screen changes in the Fellowship of the Ring. I'll be highlighting 10 of the biggest changes made in the adaptation and talking about the reasons for each. Later in the video, I'll be using these lessons to theorize about how they might be applied in the upcoming adaptation of The Wheel of Time. So expect spoilers for the Fellowship of the Ring movie and book throughout, and there will be some implied spoilers for later volumes as well. I'll warn you later when I get to the point where there will be some Wheel of Time spoilers. I am going to do breakdowns of The Two Towers and The Return of the King and more, so be sure to subscribe to the channel for those. I've previously done a similar breakdown for Game of Thrones Season 1, so you might want to check that out, as well as my foundational video in this series where I talk about the 5 biggest reasons for changes in adaptations. As I've said before, I consider The Fellowship of the Ring to be a highly successful, faithful adaptation, in that it was able to please at least a plurality of book fans and bring in countless new ones. As such, it should be considered a gold standard when examining the kinds of changes that are necessary when translating a written work to screen. It helps us to understand how this movie can feel true to the spirit of what Tolkien wrote while still changing more than you'd think. Number 1, there are changes to the characterization of most of the main characters. I'm going to highlight a few of them. I think Aragorn stands out the most. In the book, Aragorn is proud and sure of his right to claim the throne of Gondor. He carries with him only the shards of his ancestral sword Narsil to remind him of this purpose, which he never wavers from. He only sets it aside temporarily to aid Frodo. In the movie, he is described as having turned from that path a long time ago. He displays fear that he may have the same weakness and susceptibility to the ring that destroyed his forebearer Isildur. It takes the journey he's on and interactions with characters like Boromir, Arwen, and Theoden for him to be ready to make that claim. The reason I like this change is that it gives the character a real arc. You can look at Aragorn in Fellowship and see a really stark difference to where he ends up in The Return of the King. It also serves to heighten the stakes of his claim when there are more internal doubts, and to really show the seductiveness of the ring when it creates fear in powerful and brave characters like Aragorn and Gandalf. This doesn't diminish my enjoyment of Aragorn in the book, but the experiences are very different, and the movie is not meant to replace the book. We see similar types of changes in a few other characters. Merry is more of a prankster, similar to Pippin at the beginning, as opposed to the more responsible one as he is in the book. I think this allows both characters to more noticeably grow in maturity over the course of the movies. Gandalf displays more moments of weakness early in the films than he does in the books, which I think humanizes him and also shows a greater contrast to Gandalf the White. Number 2, there are a number of additional scenes, especially right at the beginning, for the new prologue. This is a technique that would not work for every adaptation, but given the way Tolkien framed his work as a recounting of a history, it fits quite well, and it makes the movie more accessible for someone walking into it completely unfamiliar with the material. It gives us an immediate sense of the scope of the story as well. Following that, there are some other additional scenes that are there to establish characters such as Bilbo, Frodo, Gandalf, and others. Number 3, the early part of the story, from Bilbo's disappearance to Frodo's leaving the Shire, takes place over a much more condensed time frame. In the book, Frodo lives quietly in the Shire for 17 years, while Gandalf is off discovering the true nature of the ring, which we learn about after the fact. In the movie, Gandalf's return is after an unknown period of time, but seemingly no more than a year. The result is that Frodo remains a hobbit who has just come of age, as opposed to the middle-aged hobbit he is for the main events of the book. There's 2 effects of this change. Frodo is closer in age to the other hobbits, which helps with the portrayal of a close friend group in the movie. And it really keeps up the urgency of the danger of the ring and the need to deal with it right away. That second effect is helped even more so by change number 4. Cuts, cuts, and more cuts. This is not a change that would normally make book fans very happy. But I have to be honest, this is my favorite thing that Peter Jackson did in this particular movie. As much as I truly enjoy the more leisurely pace of the journey in the book, to the point that it gives me a sort of cozy, comforting feeling to revisit it, I absolutely appreciate the effect on pacing and tension that was accomplished by significant early cuts to the material for this movie. To be more specific about just how much material did not make it into even the extended edition, we have Chapter 4 basically cut and replaced with this brief scene of Pippin and Merry stealing vegetables from Farmer Maggot. The next 4 chapters are also essentially removed entirely. There is no plot of buying a house in Crick Hollow. There's no Old Forest, no Tom Bombadil, no Barrow Downs. Instead, we keep a tight focus on the threat of the Black Riders, and we have a tense flight and pursuit to Bree. And it works beautifully. There are other cuts later on, but this is where the effect is seen most significantly. Number 5. There are multiple moments where Peter Jackson uses the medium of film to highlight the menace facing the hobbits in different ways than the books. One I particularly like is Bilbo letting the ring slide off his hand and leaving it on the floor instead of putting it in an envelope. The score really helps there as well. Another is the entire atmosphere of Bree is changed. In the books, it's a relief for the hobbits to reach it. And the inn and the presence of other hobbits makes it comforting. Menace only gradually creeps in. In the movie, it is a place that is never comfortable. It is dark and pouring rain, and the shots highlight the hobbits feeling small and out of place. The attack of the riders is also more viscerally frightening. There's a clearer sense that we have left the Shire already. Number 6, there are a number of scenes that replace characters relating past events to one another. Most notably, Gandalf's capture by Saruman and his escape. In the book, it makes use of Gandalf's disappearance to create some tension, but in a visual medium, we instead get to see Gandalf in danger. We also get to see Gandalf seize an opportunity to effect his own escape rather than relying on Radagast for aid. So we get this lovely shot of Gandalf speaking to a moth, which brings the eagles to his aid. It's really a perfect example of using a cinematic moment to show, not tell. Number 7, the role of Arwen is significantly increased from the bare mention she gets in the book. Peter Jackson was able to draw from a couple of book sources to make this work. There's the appendix that describes the history of Aragorn and Arwen, and he has her take over the role that Glorfindel played in the book. But let's focus on the why of it, because without these additional scenes, you'd have a brief glimpse of Arwen in the first movie, and then she'd show up in the third movie to marry Aragorn. So that payoff moment would have no impact. And viewers who hadn't read the books might be wondering, why didn't Aragorn marry Éowyn instead? So I really look at every single additional scene we get of Arwen as essential to making us care about the fulfillment of her story with Aragorn and creating that emotional payoff. She's simply a far more important character in this narrative than Glorfindel is. Number 8, I'm highlighting a specific additional scene we get of Boromir picking up the ring after it falls in the snow. You can say whatever you want about how it should be more difficult for Boromir to give it back if it was actually in his hand. But I think we absolutely needed this moment to set up Boromir trying to take the ring by force later. There's nothing that can do more to show the growing effect the ring is having on Boromir than Sean Bean's acting in this moment. And Elijah Wood also shows us why Frodo's trust in the Fellowship is starting to fail, and that is just as important. Number 9, let's talk about Moria, because there are a lot of changes to this entire sequence of the movie. The whole thing is trimmed down, but action scenes are given precedence. From the fight with the Watcher, to the cave troll, to the scene in the second hall that fills with orcs like spiders until the Balrog appears, to the collapse of the stairs and the bridge, there is a lot more action than is described in the books. I am not a fan of adding action for no reason. The Hobbit. But I think this is a case where Peter Jackson chose judiciously to enhance what was already in the books and to create some visually striking moments that were still filled with emotional resonance. And we should not forget this quiet moment that also took place in Moria, because it is the moment that most lives rent-free in my head from Fellowship.
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us.
Moving this quote from when Frodo was home in the Shire to here gives it a lot more potency. Number 10, the ending attack at Amon Hen. There are some key changes here that really give emotional heft to the ending of this film. Frodo is given a goodbye scene with Aragorn, and Aragorn lets him go. This helps Aragorn on his journey to realizing what his role is to play and to reclaim his throne. And it shows us what Frodo's state of mind is. We get to see Boromir fully attempt to save Merry and Pippin. We see him struck down, and we get the payoff of his confession to Aragorn and Aragorn's forgiveness. In the book, we're told about Boromir's death at the beginning of The Two Towers. But Boromir's death is the emotional center of the end of this film, and I can't imagine it without it. There are, of course, more changes than these 10 I've chosen to highlight. If you're interested, you can check out these lists compiled on theonering.com, which include 13 general changes for the trilogy and 68 specific changes just for the first film. I point this out to show that even in a faithful adaptation, multiple and significant changes are necessary, but it can still feel right. It's only when we examine it this granularly that we realize just how much has changed. So let's transition to talking about how these changes in the Fellowship adaptation can become lessons we can apply to the upcoming adaptation of The Wheel of Time and help set our expectations for the type of changes we might see there. In terms of book spoilers, I am trying to keep them as vague as possible, but I do recommend having read at least the first book just for understanding. And I do make mention of character names from later books as well. The first point I made about changes to characterization is a broad one and a potentially controversial one. A character seeming different than how they were written might not sit well with book fans, but there are a range of potential reasons for it. In the cases I highlighted here for Aragorn, Merry, and Gandalf, I think in each case it was to give the character a more discernible arc, to make a noticeable difference from how they are at the beginning to how they are at the end. So I'll mention a few Wheel of Time characters that might need some work on their arcs as written. For this next bit, since I am making reference to character arcs, which do encompass the entire series, even though I'm keeping them vague, if you're at all concerned about spoilers there, go ahead and skip to this timestamp. So a few that spring to mind for me are Gawain, Min, and Elaine. For Gawain, I've argued that he does have an arc. It's just more of a downward arc. But the show can do some things to, I think, make that clearer and to make his arc more relatable. The show should do as much as they can to make Gawain more likable and relatable at the beginning, playing up his humor and his self-deprecation, making him more easygoing than Galad and more empathetic. I think the show also needs to make clearer Gawain's internal struggles with being the sibling who is always overshadowed by Galad and Elaine. It can help us to understand why he struggles to play a role where he is supporting someone else if we understand that he has always felt second best. It might not be a likable trait, but it can be a relatable one. Min has an important role to play, but she doesn't change as much as other characters do from beginning to end. A focus on her character progression, I would like to see her struggle more with acceptance of her place in the pattern and what can and can't be changed. For Min, we simply see her already too accepting of the pattern when we first meet her. I would like to get to see her struggle to come to terms with it over time. For Elaine, I would say she's often interesting more for her interactions with other characters, but it's also less clear what her internal struggles are. The parts of the story that are really focused on Elaine are more about external struggles, like the Andoran succession. But I would like to have an understanding of how she needs to grow as a character. So I would put the focus on her growth to become a leader, where she understands that she needs to protect her own safety when so much depends on her. For point number 2, I think fans can be more accepting of added scenes, especially when there's references for them in the original text. But I actually don't expect the Wheel of Time to use an example like the prologue in Fellowship in any kind of similar way. Even though there's material that they could, I think they'll actually go in the opposite direction and remove the prologue of the Eye of the World with Lews Therin and perhaps save that material for a later time, because it takes a while before that can be directly connected to the main events. Instead, I think we can look to examples like Frodo and Gandalf in the cart or Merry and Pippin at the party for examples of how a lot of characters are going to need to be introduced in that first episode, and they need to tell us a lot about each character in that first introduction. And to do so, they're probably going to have to deviate from source material. I'll talk about points 3 and 4 together: the condensed timeline and all the cuts that occur in the journey from Hobbiton to Bree, because I think both are essentially about pacing, but also about finding the essence and focus of the narrative. In a book series, there's time and space to have scenes that might be nearly entirely about world building. But on screen, a scene is generally going to have to accomplish multiple things at once, incorporate world building with action, with character development, etc. The significant cuts for pacing are more likely to come into play in later seasons of The Wheel of Time. But I think it's at least safe to say that I don't expect to see scenes like Moiraine delivering Padan Fain's entire backstory to the rest of the party, or Loial giving a treatise on the ways. I think key pieces of information will be condensed and then incorporated into other scenes. I'll also talk about points 5 and 6 together, because in both cases, I think these are the types of changes that are easier for fans to accept. Changing the atmosphere of a location, layering on strong emotion with cinematography and score. These are the types of changes that we expect to see and really highlight what can be done in film sometimes that can't be done on the page. So these are reasons why we want to see adaptations. Similarly, when we get to see something that we only heard reference to on the page, it can be a bonus. But I think it's important to remember that these things can also be trade-offs, because it's often the case that they are in some way replacing something that was done in the book to try to accomplish something similar in a different way. Point number 7 about the increase in Arwen is fun to talk about, because we can speculate about which Wheel of Time characters might need to get a similar increase in focus in order for them to have enough impact. The obvious candidate in season 1 is Loghain. We already know we're going to be seeing more Loghain than we saw in the early books. We also have early introductions of characters like Siuan, Lyanna, Alanna, and Liandrin, which might indicate a relative increase in focus for them among the Aes Sedai. And we might see something similar with Aemon Valda among the White Cloaks, given his early introduction. I think in the next few seasons, we're going to need to see similar strong focal point characters for groups like the Shan-Chan and the Aiel. So there are characters there who might either be introduced early or given more material early. For the Shan-Chan, we might see characters like Aegyanin, Tuon, or Tylee. For the Aiel, there's so many candidates, but certainly Aviendha, Gaul, characters like Ruark or Amis, possibly Bane and Chiad. I'll skip briefly to point 9 and then end with points 8 and 10. So the heightened action sequences in Moria, I think the reason these worked in Fellowship is that they were enhancing existing elements from the book, focusing on good use of the visual medium, and keeping the emotional center on the characters. So there was appropriate focus on the danger to Frodo or Gandalf and the emotional reactions of other characters. These are important factors to keep in mind, because I think there are going to be some additional fight or battle scenes in the first season of The Wheel of Time. We expect to see the capture of Loghain, which is something referred to but not seen. And I predict the battle at Tarwin's Gap is going to get a much bigger focus than the brief appearance it makes in the Eye of the World. As someone who doesn't get as excited about big battles as some fantasy fans, I still fully support seeing these changes and giving those scenes a focus where they can truly be done justice on screen. But I stress that adding battles solely for the spectacle does not work without keeping the emotional stakes at the nexus. To do that, you need scenes for setup that make us care about key characters like Loghain or Ingtar. This is also why I believe points 8 and 10 involving Boromir were so crucial, because the additional scenes focused on him formed the emotional heft at the end of Fellowship. His fall was the moment the Fellowship broke and forced the other characters to continue on their separate paths. His death loomed large over all of them through the remainder of the story. He's a character that only appears in the first third, and yet his impact shouldn't be underestimated. The choices made in the film formed that emotional catharsis that the moment deserved. So if I think about what the emotional impact at the end of season 1 of The Wheel of Time should be about, I think it is all of the characters who left Emond's Field at the beginning, realizing that there is no going back. There's no returning to the lives they left. At the beginning, they may believe they can set out, accomplish something, and return triumphant. And these characters might hold on to that idea to varying degrees as the season progresses. And one by one, in different ways, start to question and realize that that isn't how their journey is going to go. That change of understanding should be the focus at the end, and it should be clear to us as it is to the characters that they are no longer farmers or blacksmiths, wisdoms or innkeepers. For some of them, it might be painful or exhilarating, and for all of them, it is terrifying. But I do expect to see additional scenes that focus on that theme or something close to it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Are there other notable changes from Fellowship that you liked or didn't like? Which characters in The Wheel of Time need more work on their arc? And which characters should get the Arwen treatment for more focus? Are there moments from the first couple of books that you think should be trimmed for pacing? And what should be the emotional center of the end of season 1? Be sure to subscribe for more discussion of fantasy adaptations. And until next time, gird your loins, my friends.